All right, everyone, welcome to the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts Project Grants for Organizations workshop. This workshop is geared specifically towards our April 3rd, 2023 deadline. So who is RISCA? Really briefly, we are an agency of state government. We are supported by both appropriations from the Rhode Island General Assembly and funds from the National Endowment for the Arts. So both Rhode Island state taxpayer money and then money from the federal government as well. Because we are distributing out public funds in our grant making, we are charged with stewarding the arts and culture ecosystem within Rhode Island. We function in addition to providing grants as a convener and connector of arts and culture communities. We're primarily known as an entity that provides grants, but it's about a third of what we do. We also provide staff support, programming, and our functions and information resource for arts and culture organizations, artists, schools, community centers, social service organizations, and local governments. As I said before the recording started, my name is Todd Trebor. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I am the acting deputy director at the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, and I'm also the 504 accessibility coordinator, which means I am the point person within the agency for internal questions among our staff around access and accessibility, and I'm charged with kind of facilitating staff education, and then as well as externally for our arts and culture community if people have questions about access and accessibility. This is a new designation for me. I'm still learning about it, and it's something that's on top of what I just have to do as deputy director. So I'm in my own learning process, and I'm really clear with that when people have questions, but I am able to figure out who to ask to answer questions. So getting into this grant program and what it's about. So just going to give you an overview of this. This is all in the guidelines as well. The Project Grants for Organizations program, which in shorthand I'll refer to as PGO, provides grants of up to $3,000 in support of arts and culture projects that are relevant and meaningful to a Rhode Island community or communities. We consider this our entry-level program for organizations. We know for many applicants, this is their first time writing a grant. It might be their only time they write a grant because there's not many arts and culture grants in the state of Rhode Island. So we have tried to set it up in that way. This application was developed with a working group, a 10-person BIPOC majority working group in the spring of 2021, I believe. Everyone involved in that working group, with the exception of 2 individuals, worked at organizations with annual budgets under $100,000 a year. Most of them were majority-led. I'm sorry, not majority-led, were volunteer-led. So they tried to set it up in such a way that would be accessible to them and to people they know that work at similar organizations, while still kind of hitting the marks in terms of what we need to know and understand about a project in order for a panel to feel comfortable supporting it. We provide both robust application support within the application, and then through grant workshops like these, you can meet with me one-on-one, and we also provide drop-in office hours on the Zoom, personed by RISCA staff. So the deadlines for the programs and when it funds things, the deadline for this cycle is Monday, April 3rd. There's always 2 deadlines a year for this program, April 1st and October 1st, except when the first falls on a weekend day, which is the case this year, in which case the deadline is the next nearest business day. But in general, just keep the 1st of April and October in your minds when you're thinking about applying at this cycle or future cycles. The April 1st deadline, in this case, again, April 3rd, supports projects occurring between July 1st and June 30th, of the upcoming July 1st through to June 30th of the following year. So in this case, the April 3rd deadline is going to be able to support project activities occurring between July 1st of 2023 and June 30th of 2024. So the entirety of the state's next upcoming fiscal year. The October 1st deadline supports projects occurring between January 1st and June 30th of 2024. Why it's set up this way is because the April 1st deadline, in this case, April 3rd, we're making grants that are coming out of the state's next fiscal year budget, which is why it has to be for things happening after July 1st, if that makes sense. And October 1st, it's a little bit easier because it's the latter half of the state's fiscal year. We already know what our budget is. I'll get more into the mechanics of that later on and what that means in terms of payment timing and all that. So types of projects that are funded in this program, the parameters are intentionally broad, so it can be as responsive as it needs to be to what communities want and need over time. But here's some hypothetical programs that have been funded in this program before. Example one, a free day-long summer cultural festival at a public park featuring live performances, including Rhode Island-based performance artists or performing artists. Just to be aware, there's nothing explicit in our guidelines about a program having to engage Rhode Island artists and hire them. It just typically, we see those being often more competitive if there are Rhode Island-based artists that are associated with a project, or at least, some of the artists involved. Example two, a free series of art classes led by a teaching artist at a social service nonprofit for a dozen adults with developmental disabilities. This is also now a kind of program that, depending on the nature of the educational program, might be eligible for the new Project Grants for Education program as well. You can always just talk to me about that if that's a kind of program that you're interested in doing, and I can help you let you know if it fits the parameters for a project grant in education, or it would be better for a project grant for organizations. And then lastly, a low-cost dance program for 8 young people for within a specific cultural community, taught by artists and culture bearers from that tradition. Again, pretty broad, right? The sense of public value can either be a lot of people being involved in it, like in a festival and a big public event, but we also see that the public value of a project might be in its deep and more intimate connections with a smaller group of individuals as well. Who is eligible to apply for this program? So a nonprofit organization of any type, it doesn't need to be an arts and culture nonprofit. Other state agencies have that restriction. We're Rhode Island, we're smaller, and we also understand that many communities don't have an organization that would fit the definition of being an arts and culture nonprofit. But a lot of other kinds of organizations, libraries, social service nonprofits, do really valuable arts and culture programming within their communities. Or if you're not a nonprofit organization, a Rhode Island-based organization using a fiscal sponsor that fits the above requirements. So a nonprofit based in Rhode Island that functions as the entity that will submit the application on your behalf if you're fiscally sponsored, and then attest to being responsible for the final reporting as well. Really, in practice, the fiscally sponsored organization is going to be the one responsible for all those things, but legally, the nonprofit takes on those responsibilities. The reason for this kind of thing, and it might not apply to any of you in this call, but we can talk about it during the question and answer break we'll have in the middle of this recording. The reason for this, the money having to go to a nonprofit, is a federal rule. So that's just what we have to abide by, but we do have this avenue for organizations that are not nonprofits to be able to still apply to this program. And we have many applications that come from organizations that are not nonprofits. The fiscal sponsor can be any kind of nonprofit also. It could be a church, it could be a library, it could be an entity that has a completely unrelated mission to your project. It's fine. We see this as just compliance with the requirement by the federal government that the money flow through a nonprofit. It doesn't really matter what the nonprofit is, as long as the project itself is meaningful and important to a community. Other things to know, and these are all in the guidelines as well. So in our general grant workshop, we go into a lot of depth about the panel process. So I'm not going to do that here, but essentially for this, I'll just say that for all of our grant programs, RISCA staff, we don't make any funding decisions. That's why we can be really helpful in the whole application process. We facilitate the process. So we assemble panels of Rhode Island residents who evaluate applications. Panels are comprised of 5 individuals. For the Project Grants for Organizations program, the panels only review up to 25 applications. So if I get 50 applications at a cycle, that means I have to have 2 panels. If I get 60 applications at a cycle, that means I have to have 3 panels. And what I do is I then randomly assign applications to each panel, because that's kind of the described best way to go about doing it when you work at a state arts agency, is just random assignments of applications. We require on the panel that at least 2 individuals be BIPOC identifying individuals, Black, Indigenous, or a person of color identifying, and that at least 1 person fit our definition of being a practicing artist. Beyond that, we do look at race, gender, ethnicity, identity, gender identity, or gender, geographic location in the state, knowledge of arts and culture disciplines or traditions, and try to also have diversity represented in the panels along those metrics. To know that we obviously can't always get every discipline in there with always 5 people, but as you will see when we talk about the application, it's less about the particular artistic merit and excellence of a given thing and more about its relevancy to a community. Partial awards in this program are very common. We say up to $3,000 a year. I'm sorry, up to $3,000 can be received when you apply for a grant. I will say that, and I need to kind of refresh these statistics now, given that we've been through the pandemic, but in general, at the spring, April deadline, I get between 60 and 70 applications typically. Of those 60 to 70 applications, about 40 to 50% of them receive at least partial funding by panels, and about 5 to 10% of those 60 to 70 applications receive full awards. So in most instances, those who receive grants are getting partial grant awards. They typically don't go less than $1,500. One of the things and the ways in which I do insert myself in the panel's conversation is when we get to funding recommendations, because panels make funding recommendations. I say to them, first off, they follow their own scoring and rankings when they do that, because they've discussed applications and scored them, et cetera. And then as we're looking at how they've ranked them, which I'll talk a little bit about more in a minute, I say to them, you need to make partial awards that are substantive enough that the project can occur in some format, which is why we typically don't see grant awards going less than $1,500. We don't want to give people a grant that they can't actually do the thing with. And we'll talk about this a little later, but if you were to receive a grant award and you're like, this isn't enough, or conditions change and you're just not able to do it, you can let me know. It's fine to decline a grant award. It happens infrequently, but it's also, you're not penalized for that. You're just being real about what you can do with what money you got. You can only have one application that you submit per grant deadline, except for if you're a fiscal sponsor. So if you're between applying for a project grant for organizations or a project grant in education, you have to choose one or the other. You can't do both. If, let's say, you're an organization that is fiscally sponsoring someone else's application, that's fine. You can still also apply for an application for your own program, even within the same grant program. We make it really clear to panels what a fiscal sponsor is and how it relates to a given project, and meaning that it's just essentially a financial or fiscal pass-through. If you receive a grant, you must credit risk on all your marketing materials. All risk grants are contingent upon the availability of funds. So we have that in there because, in particular, at the April 1st, or in this case, April 3rd deadline, the grants are being made for projects happening after July 1st when the state's fiscal year starts. For many of you who pay attention to this, it is more frequent than not that the state's budget will not pass in a timely fashion. Ideally, it passes for the next fiscal year by the end of June. And then we usually make award announcements in the first week of July after July 1st. Sometimes it takes until the middle of July or the middle of August for the state budget to be passed. So we don't technically know what our budget for grants is going to be until that budget passes. So we have to wait for that budget to pass before we can make those grants. Grant applications are considered on a competitive basis. As mentioned, panels will review them, score them, and rank them. You will be notified in the case of the April 3rd deadline, usually within 1 week of the state's budget passing. And as I said, that's always a moving target. If you need application accommodations, meaning you speak your first or most preferred or strongest language is in a language other than English, or you are a person who is neurodiverse or have certain accommodations you need, just reach out to me and I can get those accommodations set up for you. If you receive a grant, the payment can take 8 to 12 weeks to receive, and that is 8 to 12 weeks from the time that you sign your grant agreement form and submit your W-9 to the state. Payments happen outside of our office. We only initiate them. And unfortunately, this used to be 6 to 8 weeks, but because of the Great Resignation, that's hit a lot of our industries, and certainly in state government, these things have gotten slower. Any program has to happen in an ADA compliant space, also known as a wheelchair accessible space. I did that already. It's going the wrong direction. That's why. So let's talk about how you start your application, things you want to gather. So these are the things I say you do upfront before you start the narrative, and do it now because you don't want to be running around doing these things at the end. So you want to get the 50C3 determination letter if you're a nonprofit. This is a letter from the federal government that just says, yes, you are a nonprofit. SAM-UEI, this is something new. It used to be, for reasons I don't totally understand, the federal government requires that an entity, not an individual, but an entity, meaning an organization or a business that's receiving federally sourced funds, have a unique entity identifier. In this case, it's now called the SAM-UEI. It is free to request one, and this will make sense if you don't have one, but you simply need one. You don't need to register it with sam.gov. I'm going to send you all a link in the follow-up email that has a link on how to request a SAM-UEI. Do it now, because sometimes it can take just 2 days. Sometimes it can take a few weeks. If you don't have it at the time of application, reach out to me and let me know. There is still a way for you to be able to submit an application, all right? And that'll just buy you more time until I absolutely need it from you, okay? You're gonna want a recent 990 from one of the last 3 fiscal years. A 990 is a tax form that a nonprofit files, and this would be from your nonprofit or from your fiscal sponsor. We only need these, again, as a means of compliance. These top 3 things are just about compliance, right? So that we can tell the federal government, yes, we're doing our due diligence here. If you're using a fiscal sponsor, you want a letter of agreement from your fiscal sponsor clarifying your relationship. You can find a template letter for you to use at the bottom of the Project Grants for Organizations webpage. You also want to start gathering support materials. The reason why, again, I'm leading with this up front is because what I often see happen is people, understandably, get very focused on answering the narrative questions in an application. But a lot of the application and the evaluation rubric is focused on the support materials, and that's what really enlivens an application as well. So you're going to want to reach out now and get up to 4 support materials that show how your project is meaningful to your community. This can be letters of support. It can be a document that has, quotes from people who have participated in programs that you've done before, and just anything in a voice other than people at your organization talking about the value of your organization, but particularly this project you're proposing to the community being engaged by it. And then support materials that show how the artists or culture bearers involved with the project have experience that is relevant to the project. Certainly showing great work, but also, again, how their experience is relevant to the particular community identified. So I'm going to talk a bit about the evaluation criteria, and I'll show you when we walk through the application, the rubric that the panelists will be using to evaluate your application. So 60% of a panelist's score of an application comes from the community impact and engagement they perceive in the project. So is there evidence that this arts and culture project meaningfully engages and inspires its community while expanding opportunities for access for Rhode Island residents? So the sub-criteria here are, does this project have a complete and thorough understanding of the project's intended community, supported by demographic details and other data information? Obviously demographics aren't always something one can access or one kind of catalogs with their community and their audience, but to the degree that you have that information to communicate about your understanding of your community, that's really helpful for panelists because it also shows them how well you know and understand them. That the project has a deep and direct relevance to the creative expression and/or cultural heritage of an identified community. That the project engages Rhode Island residents in under-resourced geographic communities and/or historically and continuously marginalized populations. Clear and specific actions indicate that the project will be accessible and inclusive and reduce barriers to access for those who want to attend or participate in the project. I'll go over how we define historically and continuously marginalized populations in a few slides. And then lastly, remember those community support materials, that they come from a varied array of community sectors, both arts and non-arts, and reflect robust support for the project. Feasibility and likelihood of success is 40% of the score. Is there evidence that the applicant has considered all the factors necessary for their project to be a success? So that the application clearly and thoroughly states what will be done, who, what, where, when, and why the project should be supported by public funds. That the budget is clear, detailed, and accurate, and the applicant has thoroughly explained how they arrived at the numbers. That what is proposed is achievable by the applicant on their own or in partnership with others. And then lastly, that the applicant has a clear and thorough sense of what success looks like in the project and shares clear, thorough, and achievable steps that they will ensure the project is successful. Lastly, and this has more implications in the panel discussion, artistic vibrancy and intention. So to talk a little bit about what the panel does, the panel will receive their applications 6 weeks or so in advance of their panel meeting. They'll review the applications and pre-score them using a rubric that I'll show you in a little bit later on. And they're going to be looking at that 60-40, right? 60% community impact and engagement, 40% feasibility and likelihood of success. They'll pre-score applications in the grant system, and they'll also provide a score here on artistic vibrancy and intention. They'll meet for a full day's discussion via Zoom. I just facilitate that discussion and take notes based on what they're talking about. I then give them space after each discussion to readjust their pre-scores if they'd like. At the end of the day, they make funding recommendations. They're given a pot of money, and they're given, I project to them a spreadsheet that shows all their applications collectively ranked in score from ascending, high scores at the top, low scores at the bottom, right? Where artistic vibrancy and intention comes into play is really in this piece of panel discussion. So a project gets a point for each thing that it achieves here. So does a project allow Rhode Islanders to actively participate in arts and culture with project leaders who have relevant experience to the community being engaged? So, does it provide an excellent intentional experience for participants? Do the project leaders and or culture bearers involved provide relevant and respectful engagement with the identified community? And does the project directly support the creation of art by, for, and with/of a specific community? So not all projects are going to do all those things. Many of them will do one. Some will do two, some will do all three. So what we were seeing in the panel room and in the panel process is that this used to be its own criteria that was 25% of an application, but you can see how it gets a little bit muddy in relation to the community impact and engagement. So we're trying this cycle to add a level of incentive for projects that kind of hit these marks, given that we are a state agency granting out public funds. In an ideal scenario, we want to really emphasize supporting projects that are, again, really relevant to historically and continuously marginalized communities in particular, but then also that are about active participation of people who live in Rhode Island in art making or culture creation and sharing, right? Makes sense. That's what makes an active democracy. So that this one will have implications in the panel room, particularly when things are close in score. It's like, well, this one got 3 points for artistic vibrancy and attention. It also got an 87. It seems like we need to lean that way. Definition of historically and continuously marginalized. This is our own term that we're using here. The NEA uses the term underserved. In community working groups we had, there's a lot of connotations there that are not great. So this was a term that we've landed on for the moment. Language is always evolving and we'll continue to change it. The way in which the NEA defines underserved is what you see there. Again, we're using historically and continuously marginalized in place of underserved. So immigrant groups, BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, rural populations, aging populations, people living in poverty, people experiencing houselessness, people with disabilities, incarcerated populations, communities recovering from trauma or disaster, and military service members and veterans. This is important, and we're trying to underscore this a lot because both with panels and I think with applicants sometimes, when people think of historically and continuously marginalized communities, they obviously and clearly think about communities of color, which is 100% true. Depending on what community a project is occurring in, who might comprise a historically or continuously marginalized group will be different. So if a project is occurring in a largely white community, let's say it's 95% white, it would be disingenuous for them to focus the project on a community of color, right? Unless that community of color is there in that community. But it could be within that community that who comprises a historically and continuously marginalized population are the veterans in that community, are people living in severe poverty, et cetera. So we're a state funder. We are obligated to fund projects around the state. So we ask our panelists and our applicants to view who fits this definition within their community as it relates to their given community being engaged with by the project. right, we'll talk more about that in a minute. Oh, I'm going to pause the recording and you can ask questions. Just give me 1 second. All right, let's going to keep on going here. We're now going to walk through the application. So I'm going to pause the recording again and pull up the application. Hold on. So I'm going to show you all real quick how to get to the application. So one way to do so is to go to Risca's website, excuse me, and click on the grants page. Come on now. Within each grant program, we're going to go to Project Grants for Organizations. There is a link to the correct portal for you to use in order to access the grant application. We're going to click on that in a second. But I wanted to show you, these are the guidelines for the program that I'm enlivening today through this workshop. I always recommend to people, if they can, to read them twice because they'll answer a lot of questions. It's a lot of information. We have to have it there. We try to write it in a way that's accessible, but it's what it is to be a state agency. Within this, I go through the 12-step decision-making process for grant awards. I just kind of touched on that today. But at the very bottom, excuse me, zooming through, you will see that there is a link to the guidelines of the PDF in English, large print, and in Spanish, a question list in case you don't want to log in and make an account yet, which is fine. You just want to see what the application is like, the Project Grants for Organizations budget, and then there's a budget template that you will use. I'm not going to go into depth about that today, except I will send you all a video that walks through how to do a Project Grants for Organizations budget. I'll show you a little bit, but I'm not going to get crazy about it. And then the rubric that the panel will use, I'll show you a little bit later on. And then, as promised, that template for the fiscal sponsor letter. So to apply, again, you can access the portal on the page there. What it should take you to is, oops, wrong page. 1 second, everyone. It's the way the Zoom screen works. It'll take you to this page, which is our grants login page. You can see right there, it says Grant Portal for Organizations. There is a like exactly the same looking portal that's just for individuals. It also indicates on there that it's for individuals, so make sure you're in the right portal. If you're new, you just create an account. It's super easy. It'll take you like 3 seconds. Once you've done so, you will log in. And you'll be brought to this page, the apply page, if you haven't applied for a grant before from Risca. If you have applied for a grant before and have any historical or current applications open, you'll be taken to an applicant dashboard that just shows you what grants you have open, and then you just click at the apply button on the top to get here. This profile is for Amelia Canor, which is my dog, all right? So we're gonna look at a Project Grants for Organizations application. Click apply there. Oops, and it's gonna have me log in again. Bear with me, everyone. I timed out. Why is it doing that? Oh, wait. If I need to stop the recording for a second, I will. So you go to the Project Grants for Organizations on that list and you click apply, and that'll take you to the application here. The application is in 3 sections: a before you start the application eligibility quiz, an information for the panel section, and then an information for the Risca staff section. At the top of the page, you'll see here we have links to things you need for the application. First off, just the guidelines in English and Spanish, but then also the project budget template, the evaluation rubric, 2 things I'll show you in a little bit, and then the fiscal sponsor sample letter. Before you start the application eligibility quiz, this is where you answer those eligibility related questions I went over, or considerations. You know, are you a nonprofit? Are you using a fiscal sponsor? Is your project occurring in an ADA compliant space? You also need to be clear that your proposed project is not doing any of these things here, requesting funds for prizes or awards, fundraising efforts, etc. These are all restrictions that the NEA places upon us for our grants. Once you've done that, You will then get into information for the panel in which you introduce your project. You talk about the name of your organization or group. If you're a fiscal sponsor, if you're using a fiscal sponsor, you still just talk about you. You don't talk about your fiscal sponsor here, right? And then what is your mission of your organization or group? A name of the project and a project summary, and then the amount of money you're requesting. This section is just literally introducing your project. This will be what panels will refer to in panel discussion when we're starting each application's discussion. For this reason, I tell people when you write your project summary, really encapsulate what the project is in terms of who, what, where, when, and why, with the limited amount of space you have. So, you know, Todd Trebor Theater Company is requesting $3,000 to do a summer performance of Matilda Jr. at Roger Williams Park from June 15th to June 17th with children from you know, XYZ elementary school, right? Succinct, say what it is, because when they're going through all these applications, that's going to ground them in what the application is, right? And remind them about what it is. It is also the information that we use when we publicly communicate what a project is. So you want it, if you're going to be in a press release, you don't want it to be too woo, you know, you want it to be clear what it is. So the actual application proper, at the start of the application, we talk about who is on a panel, etc. First question, you're just summarizing your project. Describe what you're doing, describe when and where the project is happening, name who is involved, and share what the intent or inspiration for the project is. You can see within each question, there's the question in bold, and there's sub-questions often that are not in bold. Be sure you're answering the questions. And I say this and it seems very straightforward, but to be quite honest, about half of the applications we receive, the reason why they don't do well with feasibility and likelihood of success is they don't answer the questions. So with how the rubric is set up, and also just for the sake of panels being able to compare apples to oranges, it makes it impossible for them to do so if they don't have the adequate information. You can see there also, we indicate an ideal response length. We've erred on the side of providing you all more space in the application based on guidance from a community working group. But then within that, we're indicating, you know, ideal response lengths, you know, so you're not like, oh my God, I have 5,000 characters. That's a lot. I could fill it all up. It's like, ideally don't. Ideally, so you have to say in a couple paragraphs, right? Because again, they're reading up to 25 of these. You want to be sure that they're focused on their reading as panelists. You're then going to describe who comprises your community being engaged with by the project and why this is relevant or meaningful to them. If so, please share how you will work with this community to carry out the project. And be sure to include relevant demographics and geography of your identified community in your response. That is a hyperlink that links to resources, US zip codes, and the census, where you can look up demographic information about your particular community or what zip code the project is occurring in as a way to help orient the panel to where your project's occurring and who your community is. Third, community support materials. We talked about these. Submit up to 4. With each support material, I always recommend that you don't want it to be more, if it's written, more than 2 or 3 pages long. So you can put more than 1 letter of support, for instance, into one community support file if you want to. Those are easy for panels to digest. You don't want to submit a 100-page script, right? Because they're going to be like, what? So be thoughtful as to how much information they can intake there. If you're submitting video or audio, you absolutely can do that. You'll want to use a third-party entity like Vimeo or, hold on 1 second. Yeah, okay, great. Vimeo, YouTube, and just drop the link in there. I always say too, no more than 3 to 5 minutes on those. If your video is 20 minutes long, just indicate time points. Be like, you know, start watching at minute 3 to minute 6, or watch the first 3 minutes, and you can, you know, you have the option of viewing more, etc. Direct the panel, right? Control to the degree you can what information they're taking in to make sure they're using their time as efficiently as possible. You're then going to go to question 4, talk about who are the people involved in your project and how they're best suited for the project. You also talk about any key partners involved. If there are many artists involved, we gave the advice of just focusing on no more than 5. We understand you might be doing a large festival or a large public event that has like 30 artists involved. Just give a kind of a sample. And it kind of discusses in that question how what key partners are. You know, they could be involved in the planning, execution, or promoting of the project. You're then going to provide support materials about the people involved, as mentioned before, evidence of their work. It could be CVs, resumes, etc. Same guidance applies in terms of length and format for these particular support materials. Defining your success. Describe what a successful project looks like to you and how you will measure it. Consider things beyond numbers of attendees and post-event surveys, and keep in mind that we don't expect you to spend large amounts of funds or time on evaluation. We recommend, and this is really important, thinking about what success is for you and then figuring out what things indicate that success. This is the question that we just changed. It's always been a challenging one, and I understand for people to articulate, but this is reflective to the panel of like what degree of planning that you're engaging in, and how you're just ensuring that you're being responsive and getting some kind of feedback from the community about your project and how to make it better and continue to improve it. So like it says, you don't need to do post-event surveys if those don't make sense for you. It could be you talk with a few people involved, talk with the artists involved in the project, make it a point to talk with 10 audience members, whatever it is. Just how are you getting feedback from the community being engaged with what you're doing as to whether or not they like it and whether or not it's effective and how it can be better, right? Providing access beyond programming in an ADA compliant space. What are 3 ways your project will be accessible and inclusive and reduce barriers to those who want to access your project? What things you are doing in respect to your project to reach out and engage all people within your identified community. We want to know how you're planning to engage people from different cultural backgrounds, socioeconomic statuses, and physical and mental abilities. And there's a link there to a page for ideas and resources. So again, we're not expecting you to do all the things. Where's your project occurring? What community is it in? And how are you addressing possible barriers to access there? Things like things being free or reduced cost or whatever. Economic barriers are absolutely consideration. Are you providing daycare or a daycare option? Is it occurring at a location that's on a bus line? All of those things, right? And then to what degree you might be considering the needs of people who are neurodiverse in your programming. Again, you don't need to do all the things, but just talk about the things you're doing, right? Provide a timeline for your project. So there's a template for that. That's pretty straightforward. Just going to show all the major steps involved in accomplishing it, when they're happening, and who is doing them. Depending on your project, your timeline might just span a month, or it might be over several months. It could also be that your project timeline starts before the fundable activities of the project, because you're going to start planning, you're going to apply for grants. Again, the activities that can be supported by this particular deadline have to happen after July 1st, but it's understood that you're going to be, if your project's occurring in August, that you're going to be doing stuff in January, February, March, et cetera, related to it. Project grant budget, using a budget template. You'll need to use a budget template for this. I will show you it in a minute. I'm going to wait till we get to the end and then show you the 2 templates for the project budget and for the evaluation rubric. The timeline is straightforward. I don't feel like I need to show you that to you all, but we'll wait till these things at the end. Again, you can see there's a link within the application to a video that explains how to fill out the project budget. That was made by Jory Ketton. For those of you who might know her, she's a really fantastic artist and administrator that's based in Providence. You will then tell us how you're going to use your RSCA funds. We ask this question so we know that you're using it for eligible expenses. So it doesn't need to be long, just a few sentences. And we provide an example there as to what that can be. So if you're requesting $3,000 and it's all going to pay artists, you just say, we're using $3,000 to pay artist fees. That's it. Again, we go over what expenses RSCA does not fund. Last question in this is community support for your project. For those of you who are familiar with the term in-kind, this is where you talk about in-kind donations. Basically, it's donated items, services, or space from community members in support of your project. If you understand or know the monetary value associated with it, you can share that. But we ask this because it's a way of showing community support for a project, right? The thing to know is this donated services, space, etc., these things that are donated, that are in kind, need to come from third parties, meaning they're not people at your organization. It's not their time. It's not whatever. It's a way of showing community support from entities or people outside of your organization and their project. So it could be a graphic designer donating their time. It could be a nonprofit donating space for your project. So that's the application part. The rest of this is just eligibility documents, stuff we went over, 501c3 determination letter, CMUEI, IRS tax form. If you use a fiscal sponsor, you'll indicate that at the top, and there will be an option that will present itself for you to also upload a template letter. I'm sorry, not template letter, the letter of agreement with your fiscal sponsor. And then lastly, we just ask you to indicate who your elected officials are. It's a required question. And then there's a section that's these wild drop-down menu questions. I say here, answer these to the best of your ability. These used to be at the start of the application and people would understandably be like, what? These aren't involved in your evaluation at all. You can see it's like, what kind of institution am I? Just answer them the best you can. I check them and I modify the answers and make a note in your application that I've done so if there's an inaccuracy. Again, this is just for federal reporting that we have to ask this. I don't want anyone to get unnecessarily stressed out about it. And then you just sign and submit. So I'm going to move back up here and I will have to pause the screen a second and stop sharing to pull up these documents. Then I'm going to pause the recording. During that time, if you have any questions, you can ask me them. So 1 second, everyone. So this is a project grants for organizations budget. This is like a detail, but with any of the things that you upload, you need to have it be in, some kind of Microsoft format or as a PDF. You don't want to submit numbers or Mac versions because the system can't read it. We indicate that in the application itself. So for your budget, you'll want to submit it either as an Excel spreadsheet as it is, or as a PDF version. So in this project budget, again, you'll watch a video that'll go into more depth. There's two sides to it. There's the income side of the budget. So the various sources of income that you have coming to support something, admissions, any contracted services, tuition or workshop fees. You just fill out the things that apply to your given project. If the only income supporting this project is a RISCA grant, you're asking for $3,000, that's fine. That can be the only thing on there. No one's going to get mad at you about that. The expense side, you can see there's two sections, eligible expenses and then ineligible expenses in terms of how the RISCA funds can be used. So if you're requesting just $3,000 from RISCA, and that's the total budget for the project, all $3,000 need to be accounted for in this top section. So administrative fees, artistic fees, advertising and marketing, fine, accessibility related costs, in-state travel, transportation, space rental, utilities, materials and supplies, insurance, and then we have an other there where you indicate what those are. We go over this in the video that explains how to make a project budget, but go ahead and explain, please, explain how you're getting to your numbers and what's behind them. All right, that helps a panel understand, again, feasibility and likelihood of success, that you're thinking through things. You don't need to go crazy here. It could be you're requesting $3,000 from RISCA, $2,000 of that are going for artist fees, and you just say, $1,000 is going to Todd to do something, or an artist to do this project, $1,000 is going to Amelia to do this project. You can, if you had that level of detail and it made sense in the space there, indicate it's for 8 hours of work, or it's for 12 hours of work, it's for 4 workshops, whatever, but that's really it, all right? Ineligible expenses, just so you see those, out-of-state transportation, we cannot cover food and beverages. Any fundraising or special event costs, we can't support fundraisers. So be really clear about that with your project. If it is a fundraiser for you, it's not something you can use a RISCA grant to support. Like I mentioned in the part that's not recorded of this, equipment purchases and other capital expenses can't be funded, can't be used, RISCA funds can't be used for them. We have that here because it could be that you're requesting $3,000 from RISCA, but you have a grant that you have pending or you've requested from someone else for $3,000, and you have $4,000 in donations coming. So your total project budget might be $10,000. All we care about is that the $3,000 from RISCA are used for eligible expenses. That other $7,000 for your hypothetical project can be used wherever. It can be used for eligible expenses, ineligible expenses, blah, 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 it's fine. And remember, in the narrative question we looked at about how you're using RSCA funds in the application, you'll explain exactly for a project, particularly that has a larger budget than $3,000, where the money you're requesting from RSCA is going to be used. The rubric for this program, this is what the panel uses. So you can see here that, that it's broken down into a guiding question at the top for each criteria. The panel scores an application on a 1 through 10 for community impact and engagement. They log that score into the back end of the grant system. And then there's guidance as to what a 1 through 10 means. So in this case, it's a 10 is there's robust evidence of strong community impact and engagement across all criteria, these 5 listed here. 5 is a middle, evidence of community impact and engagement across some. And then 1 is attempted but did not meet the criteria. Again, they can score a 1 through 10. We just guide them as to what a 1, 5, and a 10 is. Same with feasibility and likelihood of success. And then artistic vibrancy and attention. Like I said, this comes in panel discussion. They scored a 0 through 3, depending on whether or not there's adequate evidence of a project, hitting one of these sub-criteria, 2 of them, or 3 of them. So I'm going to stop sharing this, stop the recording again. I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint again. Those of you who are not on the recording, you can ask me questions again at this time as I'm transitioning. Hold on one second. So this is true of this deadline. Every deadline, we have other grant support opportunities. The day of the deadline this year, April 3rd, and then the Friday prior, we will have drop-in hours. I believe it's from 10 to 4 p.m. via Zoom. You'll have to register to attend just to ensure we don't get Zoom bombed or whatever. But at that point, that's good for like last minute questions, et cetera, like, granular questions about your application. All RSCA staff is cross-trained enough in each other's programs that we can do that kind of thing. You can also sign up for a time to speak with me one-on-one, or any of us one-on-one, about a particular application or project that you have. I recommend signing up early, even if you want to talk later on, because it does get filled up as we get closer to the deadline. You'll get a link to that from me when I send a follow-up email after today's session. Grant draft review. If you've started your draft application by the weekend prior to the deadline, so I believe that's like March 25th, I send an email out through the system for anyone who started a Project Grants for Organizations application, and I say, hey, if you want me to review a grant draft, you can sign up for a time here. I have limited slots for that. I think I'll probably have like 10 or 12. What you do is you sign up for a time for me to review your draft grant application. You can either email it to me, or I'll just look through the back end of the system at it. You don't need to be present at that time you sign up for, and actually you won't be. It's a way to organize my time that you sign up for a time slot. So that means I'll be reviewing your application at 9:30 a.m. on a Thursday, right? I will send you at the end of that day an email with as much feedback as I can give you in that half-hour time I've dedicated to your application. If you have specific things you want me to look at, you just email me and be like, hey, Todd, I signed up for a time for you to look at my application draft. Please focus on the budget and this question I have about, defining success. And I'll focus on those things first, and then I'll go through the rest of it as I have time to. I've gotten very fast at reading these things to the point where I can't really read a book successfully anymore. The Arts Administrators of Rhode Island Facebook group is a link I'll send you. It's a peer support group we have on Facebook if you're on that platform, where you can ask questions of one another. It also has really kind of primarily functioned as a way for us to share resources with you all, both stuff about, how to nonprofit stuff, but then also, grant opportunities that we have or that we're aware of that we want to communicate with you all as well. And you'll get links to those things, as well as this in a follow-up email. Next Wednesday, March 8th from 10 to 11:30 a.m., same time slot as this today, we'll be hosting a free workshop via Zoom in partnership with Arts Equity and Grantmakers Council of Rhode Island on creating access and nonprofits disability rights under ADA and 504. There will be a recording available if you can't attend live. I said link is in the chat, but that is a lie, because if I'm doing this solo, I can't also share links in the chat. It'll be in a follow-up email, you receive that. But it just basically goes over what exactly is required of nonprofits by the ADA and 504 legislations federally, which both deal with disability rights and access for people with disabilities, and then some starting steps on how you can get started achieving those beyond wheelchair access. Yeah, stay tuned for that. And if you have any more questions, you can just email me. I have in my signature when I respond to you a link to sign up for a time to chat with me if there are really complex questions, but simple questions are usually things I can answer. And it's never a harm in asking me a question via email. And if I'm like, that's gonna be a conversation, let's schedule a time to talk. Or I'll just be like, hey, actually I can answer that super quick. All right, I think that is it. So for the sake of the recording, thank you for being here and watching this recording. And we'll open this up to any more questions from the people on the call right now.